After Tekken 5's wonderfully action-packed and upbeat opening, Tekken 6 follows on from that game's canonical ending to express a more somber and tragic atmosphere. Setting the stage is Kazuya, Devil's incarnate. He is indeed alive and leading the same G-corporation that both resurrected and betrayed him in the prior games. Jin Kazama's warmer intent has invited a cold militant backdrop as he wages corporate warfare across the world with his newfound power. MIGUEL watches his sister perish in front of him at the hands of Jin's uncaring conquest. 3 men strapped for cash cannot hit the world's largest moving target. Leo Kleinerson leaves flowers at his mother's grave, a victim of murder amidst the world war of corporate espionage. Embittered, Leo takes justice into his own hands. If it concerns a dead parent, Kazi is probably the best place to start. Only the home console openings detour to introduce a lighter side of Tekken, with Asuka parrying Lili's advances. Like any Frenchman, she cannot take a hint. Functional weapons and customization options make a debut, and Paul symbolically shows how useless they are. Brian gets pummeled into Rage Mode, a low health comeback mechanic. Then he forward twos into Death Fist and it's so cool. ZAFINA looks into the abyss to find what looks to be an Egyptian god, actually a Judaic deity. As one might imagine, he's the final boss of Arcade Mode. These are the better openings, leading with examples of war-torn destruction. The cause of the war is a logical outcome of Kazuya having made Mishima Zaibatsu something of a state when he took over Hokkaido. Heihachi afterward would use the Zaibatsu's Tekken force to settle wars to its advantage, with the excuse of cultivating wastelands as an act of charity. Later he raided G-corp in Tekken 4's intro to discover Kazuya, and in Tekken 5 G-corp retaliated upon the Mishima dojo. It makes sense, but Jin's in charge now, and he could have easily eased the tensions, which he's very clearly chosen not to do. In the third opening, he's very metaphorically instigating the corporate war further. It's escalated to the point that Xiaoyu can't even practice her back-turn stance in peace. This opening might be the most pointlessly cool thing in all of Tekken. It introduces Lars and Alisa for their gameplay rather than their characters, as the protagonists of the scenario campaign, a fully fledged Tekken 4 style scripted story mode. To get us in the mood, we have a hilarious depiction of child abuse on Heihachi's part. It's styled in a dark, dingy, dirty animated graphic novel of the series past, hitting all the high notes. There are embellishments and details that aren't covered in the games or their manuals for the sake of this game's themes. We have what can barely be called insight on why Kazuya picked out Jun, as at the very least a fling. As for her fearlessness. Her pregnancy and the time she spent with her son Jin is shown to emphasize the young boy's adoration of her, and how strongly her death affected him. He just wishes to see her again. A great hatred sprang up from him as he found his revenge. There's emphasis put here on Jin's severe reaction to Jun's death, and what he saw in Ogre reflected in himself. The origin of Jin's downfall is placed here, at the end of Tekken 3 rather than at the end of Tekken 5. This is at least in service of intention themes presented in this game's story mode, but to justify his change of heart in Tekken 4 you have to scrape up some pretty convincing headcanon. For more information on these games, please see my Tekken playlist. Jin's immediate act as the head of the Mishima Zaibatsu is to announce an independence as a state and to declare war on the world. Shockingly, the world didn't laugh this off. No, it's actually pretty close. They evidenced this by the balkanized Mishima Zaibatsu taking over the UN. That is an actual headline right here in this screenshot. How do you become a member state of an organization when you're at war with every other member state in that organization? Since Jin is seen to have gone insane, G-corp are now seen as a resistance cell, and they seem to be the only ones winning fights against Jin's Tekken forces despite being nearly as evil. This is where Lars comes in, an ex-Tekken Forcer with his own like-minded unit, sabotaging the Zaibatsu using its own resources. Lars is punching missiles and dodging bullets to establish his skill and power, but this also subtly suggests that firearms aren't the primary method of combat at close quarters when people of this power level exist. He even survives explosions. He who fights monsters might take care, lest he thereby become a monster himself. And if you gaze for long into the abyss gazes also into you. Around a hero, everything becomes a tragedy. Around a demigod, everything becomes a satyr play. And around God, everything becomes... well, what do you think? Perhaps the world? Despite raiding Mishima compound, they're ambushed by G-corp Jacks, and after a tutorial battle with the squadron, Lars' unit accounts for casualties. A lone soldier, nameless, lies dead. Lars takes the time to honour and lament the man. This is here to show Lars is an otherwise good man who puts himself apart from the two competing evils of the world. The moment's cut short when a Jack-sick suicide bombs as a last-ditch attempt, and Lars puts himself on the line to save his comrades. He doesn't save anyone though, and as he regains his footing, he's witness to the activation of the resident cute gynoid, Alisa BOSKONOVICH. It quickly becomes apparent that having exposed himself to one too many concussive blasts in the past 10 minutes, Lars has developed amnesia. There's an interaction with a Jack to say that despite both of these characters being blank slates for the time being, they still know how to kick ass. Lars, looking to save her, has to drag Alisa from a coffin. She says her father wants her to stay there. Since Lars and Alisa seem to be looking out for one another from inherent kindness, they retreat from the situation together. Hard to find someone you can trust in a world at war, I suppose. This is our setup. Together they endeavour to explore the world. Brian is the first they meet, another killing machine given further life by BOSKONOVICH.
Fight!
Shockingly, after all the experimenting in Death by Degrees and Devil Within, attempting comparatively restrictive or simplified control schemes compared to Tekken proper, Scenario Campeign really does just play like Tekken 6. All the better for it. It's a return to the Tekken Force mode. As for the game proper, Dark Resurrection hasn't been so much iterated upon as expanded upon. After walking back 4's extreme environment focus, Tekken 6 has reintroduced the destructible environment conditions, but also this time downward. Opponents can be forced downward into the ground at scripted areas and shatter surfaces that send you down to a lower floor with a different environmental layout. It's effectively a stage transition mid-match, meaning, along with considering wall distance, it's now paramount you be aware of your footing in some stages. Suddenly the stakes become a lot higher, even though ultimately the floor breaks don't really mean much unless you're playing competitively, or have very thin skin. To activate it, you need to either spike the opponent on the floor, or bound the opponent during a juggle. The new bound state is an extension of the juggling state. Part of juggling's limitation is that gravity's effects require you use moves with range and fast startup animations, especially toward the end. Terminal velocity is reached very quickly. However, with a good ground bound, the enemy is lingering on the floor for a decent second, allowing you to wind up an attack that wouldn't usually hit an airborne enemy as part of your combo, so long as the attack hits low enough. Even if you don't catch on to this, the animation looks cool enough, and it often helps space out juggles you have to memorize into sections, letting you collect yourself as the bound animation plays out. The bound, whilst keeping the juggled enemy nearby on the floor, does not reset juggle's increased distance after every hit, so in many cases it either gives a stronger ender or a stronger beginning. But there's variety per character. The floor breaks themselves cause bounds, allowing extended combos after what would usually just be spikes to the floor that might allow a follow-up. My few main issues with bounding is how unbearably low the animation leaves enemies. The number of follow-up attacks you can use is really restrictive, especially for legacy characters whom have been more or less reanimated from Dark Resurrection, save for some additional moves that cause bounds. There's just not many moves added to take advantage of them. There's also the issue of how it allows for extended wall combo, but that's generally higher level play stuff. Bound itself makes its way into the scenario campaign, but floor breaks are reserved for scenarios that force you to fall through the ground. Wall breaks, however, practically function like they did in Tekken 4, save for one stage where it initiates a ground break as well. Specific walls will collapse on wall splat. The primary difference since last time is that these are broad walls, and breaking it simply enlarges the stage, and could cause or lengthen a given juggle. Given that these stages are non-symmetrical, and different characters are preferred to be sidestepped or sidewalked in different directions, there are certain imbalances introduced by the stage selection. The issue here is that there are only 4 stages that take advantage of this. 2 of them feature floor breaks, 1 a wall break. For the final release, they finally had the confidence to add a stage that combines both of them into one stage transition. That's 4 stages out of a selectable 15 in Versus mode. 2 further stages, Hidden Retreat and Fiesta del Tomate, appear only under random select, making it a 4 in 17 chance, less than a quarter of hitting a destructible stage. This is extremely reserved, and you can still sense the team's light hand when introducing anything new to Tekken's formula since Tekken 4's reception, 6 years later. The sequel, Tag Tournament 2, featured 11 out of 27, about 40% of stages having destructible elements, and even expand the mechanic to balconies, which shows how the concept introduced was generally accepted and found enjoyable. In retrospect, the bravest things about Tekken 6 were firstly, featuring a fully realised story mode that maintains the mechanics almost wholesale of one of the most difficult and dense games of a notoriously difficult genre, featuring bosses that break those mechanics and cheat the system to stack odds against you. Obviously, this didn't go down very well in its day, and it was seen as an extra mode on the level of mini-games like Tekken Ball by journalists, despite clearly having the full force of the development team behind it. And secondly, Tekken 6's other bravest choice was in its new characters' designs. Lars is a bishi ripped straight from Sentai Tokusatsu. He looks and plays like a Power Ranger, unnecessary flips and all. He's got an easy mode wave dash and evasive stances that really frustrate and confuse visually. When getting trounced by him, it's easy to be pissed off with how cool he must think he looks. Alisa, in comparison, is a Russian, teen-sized orbital frame in the vein of Saishu Heiki Kanojo. She controls spacing in the game with the delicacy of Megasex LR. If you didn't understand those references, that's because Tekken's character influences have strayed quite strongly from the antiquity of fiction of world cinema it once had, where Wesley Snipes could fight Jackie Chan in Fight Club. Instead, characters such as Leo, Lili, Alisa, and Lars are drawn straight from Japanese anime stereotypes, undermining them with slight twists. Alisa breaks the tradition of being a kawaii robot girl by having vicious, comedically horrific, dehumanizingly robotic traits that, rather than undermining her porcelain perfection, outright destroy first impressions. This trope inversion has become extremely common and no longer hits as hard. Lars breaks the tradition of being a Power Ranger by being a Swede, part of a military unit, and not being afraid of holding other people's lives in his hands, despite being ostensibly one of the good guys. Dark Resurrection's Lili breaks the tradition of being French by actually wanting to fight and shaving her legs. The further new casts from 6 follow this trend. Bob is apparently peak fighting condition for his weight class, which would make sense if we had to create a new weight class. His appearance is even more American than Paul Phoenix. Complete with a wave dash, he hits quite hard and has shocking evasion for how much screen space he takes up. The speed and smoothness with which he plays adds a layer of visual comedy, which is undercut by Bob's sheer charisma and self-belief. He's actually strangely cool once you get past first appearances. Unlike ZAFINA, whom shares Lars' self-absorption, leaving her visually attractive, but somewhat lame. The play here is that this Shantae-like, exotic, fit, belly-dancing Middle Eastern chick will fold up and take pointed, ugly body language in her annoying, powerful, evasive stances. Leo's impeccable, sturdy form leaves an extremely stiff-feeling martial artist. His stances are powerful and give mix-ups on block or hit, but have a lot of commitment and telegraphing. Leo's gimmick is the ambiguity as to his sex, but it's played very tastefully. Usually in these instances you get Guilty Gear's Bridget, where a cute young girl at first glance is actually packing a Magnum monster can. It's played up for its associated audiences, including Bridget's gameplay being literally planting traps around the screen. Leo instead is given a sexless quality, without leaning on Bridget's tropish sense of cute infancy before secondary sexual characteristics develop. In fact, he's uncommonly mature for this trope. It's more like some kind of castrato, fitting for the modern Germany. I'm very fond of their execution of Leo. Their inspiration for this choice was to make a character everyone felt comfortable playing as, regardless of what they might be downstairs or upstairs. Since my sub-character is Ling Xiaoyu and I should apparently only feel comfortable playing characters with chorious glocks, I have fantastic news for Bridget fans interested in Tekken. Speaking of manly transitions, Miguel's a stance character. His lack of training shows in his animations. He loiters and saunters. It also means he doesn't exactly lean into his hits, giving him a severe lack of range without some big dedication from his legs, unless he's in his signature stance. Getting into this stance requires a vital moment, which means most of what Miguel does is try to close gaps he himself creates, in order to transition into that stance and batter you. His stereotype of a macho rogue has the kind of heterosexual flamboyance you can only really find in a Spaniard. He's the badass with a heart of gold. Typically these characters have a single person whom they confide in, a cuter, more vulnerable sidekick of sorts who acts as both a subject for the badass to dote upon in their best moments, and foils the badass in an emotional plea at their lowest moment. That sidekick was Miguel's late sister. The twist here is that he truly is all alone. Outside of some brief narration in his story mode, those better qualities are never exposed, having been buried with her as he looks for revenge. The lab explosion has us introduced to two bit parts in this grand story. They're being explained to that Jin had his own personal guard at this facility for reasons he leaves mysterious. Una Williams' story here is that she gets paid to be something like a terrorist/bodyguard, causing civil unrest in the world for Jin. The non-canonical Death by Degrees has her fighting the Tekken Force. Tekken 3 had her trying to kill Jin. Now she's on his payroll? In opposition, her sister Anna joins G-corp to be with Nina's sugar daddy's daddy. Their endings suck. Eddie Gordo's doesn't. As he lost the tournament in Tekken 5, he failed to acquire the Mishima Zaibatsu's medical facilities, leaving his capoeira master and Christie's grandfather's life still in the peril of a mysterious disease. Jin offers those facilities to Eddy, under the condition that he fights under him as part of the Tekken force. Immediately, Eddy disappears from Christie's side, taking the old man with him. There's no doubt that Eddy's out here committing atrocities and helping Jin, and another rationale behind his acceptance likely comes from Kazuya being Jin's direct opposition. You can't help but sense a reluctance on his part though, and it's all for nothing. After the events of the game, we find Christie as the old man's coffin is lowered into its grave. She slaps Eddy, asking him where he'd been all this time. The answer he'd give wouldn't satisfy her anyway, since he wasn't at the old man's bedside. Even Christie couldn't be there for her grandfather on his deathbed. Alone, and imprisoned in a hospital, the capoeira master apparently died how he'd lived. This is the Tekken world map. Supposedly this is somewhere in Japan since the arena is here, which will make less and less sense as the game goes on. On this map, stages unlock progressively, and often branch into dead ends or alternate routes for your way to the next story beat. Nearly every character gets their own stage, and in true beat-em-up fashion, after you beat a character's stage, you unlock them to play in any mission you've unlocked on the map. Every character, except for Dragunov, has some dialogue on their perspectives on the state of the world, or at the very least just replying to Alisa in character. The most interesting interactions happen between characters who already hold strong relationships in the story, unless it makes no sense for them to be fighting each other, such as Harang and BAEK or mirror matching. This gets you no dialogue. And as you get closer to the core story members, their comments illuminate and play upon canon a lot more. Don't worry though, if you're really interested in seeing a single character's perspectives on the game's events, or Godspeed if you main Yoshimitsu or Mokujin, who aren't unlocked until after the story mode by the way, you get to pick one free character all the way at the start. I picked my main Brian, then went into the first stage and immediately unlocked Brian. The game also generally rewards you for staying with the main character, through the treasure chests enemies occasionally drop when they die. They unlock ugly outfit options that buff stats and give your hits a chance to induct status effects like freezing, bound or poison. Eventually bosses start using these effects too. Items are divided up into colour schemes, littering your menu, and typically if you have one with a great buff, you'll struggle to find anything that matches it. All in all, relying on this detracts from the game visually, and as the difficulty ramps up, your protagonist will start to look stupid. It somewhat makes sense in universe since Lars would be trying to go incognito, given he's a wanted man. It's just a shame he also forgot how to dress. How do we travel this world map? Lars luckily runs into good company almost immediately. Jin's been apprehending Lili's father's oil fields, and with her family pocket getting a bit shallow, she decides to give our protagonists her 4x4. I reckon it's not even worth its weight in scrap. The price of diesel must be unconscionable. She's got a seething personal vendetta against Jin, and upholding French tradition, she asks someone else to fight for her. Jokes aside, I like playing as and against Lili. Her athleticism is very well defined, emphasizing evasion, and her movement is quite unique. Especially in this game though, her hits feel a bit bare bones, and the spacing between them in her strings can be a bit awkward, perhaps to force her pace rather than her opponent's. I don't mind her forced contention with Asuka, but their endings and pandas are literally the same with different limp punchlines. The lily flower is a symbol of and translates back into Japanese as yuri, which is a slang term for lesbian and a genre of female homoerotic fiction among mostly otaku culture. Rather than just making Lili an anime character too, I'd rather if they told Lili's perspective through the pretentious and romantic lens of stereotypically French media, such as new wave cinema or musical. There's a chance to actually have their perspectives with each other clash, and if you ask me, the team don't push their joke far enough. Immediately afterward, our boy Lars is tracked down by Togou, a prominent member of Lars' rebellion faction. As he won't appear too often, he's given a distinguishing facial scar and a machete that he'll never actually use on camera, just to break up his generic Tekken 4 silhouette. He stands out. Togou's been trailing Lars since he disappeared at the lab and is very eager for his amnesiac leader to return. Symbolically, he picked up Lars' insignia, a patch that notes his unit back at the lab. He hopefully tries to hand it back to him, but Lars graciously denies it for the time being. He's not ready to take the mantle yet. The unit is named Yggdrasil, which is the name of Norse mythical world tree. These common myths are trees that are the center of all life. What separates this from other world tree myths like it is that Yggdrasil supposedly means Odin's gallows, Odin being the king of the Norse gods, and having sacrificed himself symbolically on the tree. As the plot elapses, it'll be easier to assume this is a knock at Jin, since Odin was also the god of war and battle among other things. Kazuya and Azazel are also other candidates, but it could also be a play on another Neitzschean quote that God is dead and we have killed him. Odin being the god of gods in his myth, there is a lot of imagery of sacred and religious places being destroyed in this game, which may symbolize the collapse of traditional morality that Neitzsche prophesized. The issue here is that Odin was a self-sacrifice and it was part of a rebirth rather than a collapse, so I'm probably looking too far into it. Machete Scarman Togou recommends finding Heihachi Mishima. Apparently Lars always needed to speak with him. Maybe it'll jog his memory. As the gameplay is pretty much just recanned from the main game, the primary story has to be told around it, through these cutscenes and stages that emphasize different areas of this world and the struggles they face. The amnesia is a framing for introducing the player into a world that's at war, and the implication those things have on characters who find their place within this system. Bob, despite being a joke character with a joke ending, puts his strength to use as a vigilante, true to the opening. As both absolute and relative poverty increases due to war, crime also increases. People rob banks, they attack pedestrians on the street, giving you people to challenge your progress who aren't just Mishima or G-corp. BAEK and Harang are freedom fighters now, against Jin most likely. Paul is hanging around downtown breaking shit. Law is plotting wacky schemes to make money. Feng is terrorizing Chinatown looking for dojos. Julia is breaking into places to save trees. Leo is spelunking, which is a real word. Either the Japanese take education extremely seriously, or Xiaoyu's mental illness is getting worse. She still seems to think school is open while there's pandemonium on the streets. I opted to send her Uncle Wang in there to put her to sleep. Oh, that doesn't sound good. Her ending is her pleading with Jin, a man responsible for deaths that must amount to an attempt at human genocide at this point, not to jump off a bloody roof. I mean, she's right, but thankfully this dream ends just before it's about to get good. Wang is here for much sadder reasons. He joins the tournament filled with regret that he couldn't save Jinpachi, and to finally lay the Mishima Zaibatsu to rest. His stage in the scenario is among the best. It branches immediately at the start to be 2 stages in one, with a bunch of replay value for if you want to see alternative dialogues among characters. Wang is a very wise old man. Despite being described as an extremely successful, if not reclusive merchant, and wearing some quite flashy yet rustic clothing, he seems to live in relative squalor. Rather than thinking of this as a contradiction, you could assume it's intentional, and it only makes the old bat seem more sage. He plays one of the larger bit parts along Lars's way. He sees something of someone he once knew in Lars's eyes. His eyebrows, the pointy hair, and the electricity are quite reminiscent. He claims Jin is pure-minded, but also points out Alisa to remind us she came from one of Jin's labs, stating that she's dangerous. This is a brilliant observation if you can read in between the lines. Wang truly lives up to the stereotype of a wise old Chinese man. What he's trying to say is that the animatronic girl with chainsaws for hands and rocket kicks that break the sound barrier might be dangerous. Somewhere between Jin's intentions and how he deals with them, this world has gone to shit. Giving a hint about an epitaph discovered during the ogre incident, the wise old man claims Lars has what it takes to be the protagonist. It's a tacit retirement for himself, and I hope he spent the last of his days here happy. In his own ending, he falls dead after defeating Azazel. He'll finally get to see Jinpachi again. If any one of his endings had been canonical, we would be in a better place, and it matches BAEK's ending where he dies saving his pupil. These 2 Tekken originals haven't been seen since this game. BAEK's not really been a character since Tekken 2, so giving him this kind of ending somewhat redeems the wasted potential of the character. Lars wanders off to make a phone call and ZAFINA reveals herself from the darkness, which confuses me. Why would ZAFINA hide if her intentions are good? All this does is serve to put Wang's motives into question, which they shouldn't be. ZAFINA seems to pop up every now and then as the voice of prophecy of this world, telling Jin he needs to chill out. The issue is that's all she ever does. She's a useless character.
Who are you? I have no business with you.
Alright, maybe she's okay. In the next couple cutscenes, Jin speaks as if the die has already been cast. Her warnings aren't unheeded. They're accepted. In fact, Jin knows more about the situation than ZAFINA. The temple they're stood on holds Azazel, and they imply that warring is rousing him awake. And for whatever reason, Jin claims only he can defeat the godlike creature. There's an implication that this is part of a larger plan. What could he be planning to do with Azazel? Will it justify the warring? How can he be so confident that nobody will stop this plot?
How is it you know that? No.
Wang's earlier questioning has Lars introspect as to what exactly Alisa is. She's clearly a combat robot like the Jax, but her free will is unprecedented. The backstory is that she's a robot in the image of Dr. Boskonovich's late daughter. The Doctor's achievements are astounding. He created an ICBM for the USSR at 12. Since then he's been a bioengineer for Roger and Alex. Within the time between Tekken 2 and 3, developed a cold sleep machine used for Anna and Nina's stories. This was so they could stay looking young after a time skip, but you can make the leap and assume that these efforts were in some way designed to stave off a young Alisa's death, to allow him to cure her. This clearly failed. His primary character motivation in 3 was trying to find some way to revive his daughter using Ogre's blood, somehow. Brian's storyline in 4 and 5 has BOSKONOVICH complaining Brian's body is too complicated, so instead he implants a perpetual energy generator of his own making. Ignoring that bizarre sentence, they might not have planned it, but in retrospect you can see the connecting dots in this storyline to Tekken 6. It's likely what's powering Alisa. Now, like any ex-USSR scientist, he gives his allegiance to the highest bidder, the Mishima Zaibatsu. It seems he's taken an opportunity to put his expertise into a successor of the Jack project, but the Doctor was so lost in his loss he forms its appearance after his late daughter. In some way he's achieved what he wanted to do. His sweet daughter is back, and she might even be mass-produced one day. But for now, this model looks upon the world with fresh eyes, with little quips and logical outlooks that point out the absurdity of the characters he face every mission. In this way, she is sweet and amusing, and easily warms you if you bother to read her mission reports. Heihachi's stage is another one of those multiple pathway ones, which is even better this time because Heihachi is hard as fuck, and there aren't any checkpoints in this relatively short stage. He's got one of those cutscenes afterwards where even though you fucked him up, he just gets back up like he's got another 5 health bars. I guess fighting Heihachi got the neurons firing because Lars suddenly recalls that he's actually Heihachi's bastard son. Surprisingly civil conversation, all things considered. For a lot of people, hearing about this is the moment that Tekken's story jumped the shark. The family tree branched out a bit too far this time, it's a total asspull, and I have to say I agree. They struggle to make characters not directly related to the Mishimas relevant in any way. The solution isn't to make more Mishimas. But this plot twist is actually here for a good reason. Narratively, this makes him Kazuya's half-brother and Dude, you can't just pull a gun you don't even have out of the back of your skinny jeans and cue the action music. It doesn't work like that. Even Alisa's like, dude, what are you doing? You are pointing a gun at your father. Where the hell did this come from? Uh-oh, Alisa's distracted. Heihachi Mishima! This is payback. Oh no. Skip that lesson with Jin, didn't you bald bastard? And like, Lars pulled the gun to ask where the epitaph was, and Heihachi's all like, it's hidden and heavily guarded. You'll never get anywhere near it. Then Togou immediately calls after this like, yo, we found it, meet in 5. Then Lars just walks his flat ass out of there and calls this a waste of time. The whiplash comes immediately after Lars redevelops his pre-amnesiac personality, in an extreme contrast to his previous tentative views. Lars sees himself as fighting for some kind of justice, and it justifies insane actions like remorselessly shooting his father in the face. So now to look for that MacGuffin, Lars is pushing towards the Mishima HQ. How well hidden. There's really not a purpose to finding this thing. The story needs an excuse for Lars to infiltrate more populated areas to expose a shocking imagery of a first world country at war. This unnamed metropolis bears very unspecific resemblance to a futuristic New York. Instead of avoiding being found, we make the switch to high-profile tactics more befitting of a self-modeled hero. As we penetrate the war zone, we meet Lei Wulong. Apparently this cop is public enemy number 1 around here, since he's onto something and both sides don't want anyone to know it. It doesn't matter who you pick, you get to fight alongside Lei here, instead of against him as a boss. And even if his own story mode is quite lame again, this is a really satisfying pedestal for an absolute fan favourite. Bizarrely, Lei even gets his own cutscene after this, where he shares some positive exchange with Lars, and then makes a break for it under their cover. This is because Alisa can hear a Mishima helicopter on its way. She can tell the make and model just from the sound. And she takes off to fight it. We have the team showing off their real-time 3D animation in this story mode. First, she tries to fish its fire away from Lars on the ground, but she greatly underestimates the helicopter, and it manages to curve its laser missile guidance system toward her around a building. What? Oh dear, our android heroine is dazed despite being a robot, and she carefully regains her surroundings. Man, you know helicopters, well known for being quiet and sneaky they are, especially when she heard it coming a minute ago. Then instead of outmaneuvering it like she is obviously capable of, she runs in a straight line so it can shoot her in the back and then try to blend her with its blades. Oh, wait a second, she forgot that she's basically invincible. It's time for this ridiculously forced action scene to end. She scalps the rain dome, then chainsaws the AI driving it so white blood splatters on the glass.